The effects linker is an extremely powerful part of dynamics, and especially with particle dynamics. We can access the effects linker under the Dynamics tab and under Effects Tools by selecting Effects Linker. Now right now we don't really have anything in our scene, so we will need to set some things up. First I want to go into Modeler, and what I want to do is just create a couple of objects. First I'm going to start out by creating a box, and I'm going to clear out the segments. And actually I will create one segment on the x-axis, and just using the right arrow key. And we're just going to move this box out a little bit, hit the spacebar to end this tool, and now what I want to do is just select our polygons on the end, H on the keyboard just to stretch this inward, and then Shift D on the keyboard to metaform, and then H on the keyboard once again for the stretch tool, and we're just going to pull this out. And I just want to create a fairly simple object, very low polygon. And what I want to do is select Shift J for the Jitter tool. We're going to do a normal jitter, and I'm going to set our range to 0.1. And we just want to jitter this a little bit to change its variation. I'm also going to Shift J once again and jitter it one more time. And now I'm going to raise the polygon amount a little bit more, Shift D on the keyboard to subdivide in metaform. And then once again I will be jittering with the same value of 0.100. And I'll do that once again. And now we have an object that we're going to be using for our effects linker. And I do want to make sure that we don't have any non-planar polygons, and the best way to do this is to hit Shift T, which is going to triple all of our polygons and take all of our 4-point polygons and turn them into 3-point polygons. This will eliminate any non-planars that we end up running into. So next I'm going to hit F2 on the keyboard, which is going to center this object completely into our scene, which is going to make it easier for us to adjust its pivot point and actually make it so we will not need to adjust the pivot point once we are in layout. I'm going to hit Q on the keyboard to open up our surface editor, or our change surface, and I just want to call this rock and click OK. And now what I'm going to do is go ahead and save this out, and then we can switch over to layout and start working on our scene before we actually load this into the scene. But now we just have this rock object set up that we're going to be using. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out, and we can switch over to layout. And now we need to create some particles for this. And I'm going to be creating the same sort of effect I did in previous chapters, where we kind of had asteroids or meteorites falling from the sky. And this time we're going to be replacing our particles with these objects and using the effects linker. So we'll go to the Dynamics tab and add in a particle. We're going to select HV emitter because we do not want these showing up. And even though we're not going to apply the HV emitter effect to it, we don't want those particles rendering within our scene. And we can just call this emitter, and actually I'll call it emitter underscore main, and click OK. And now I can change our generator size. I'm going to go ahead and increase this to 10 meters by 10 meters. Actually, I might increase that a little bit more. We'll go ahead and do 20 meters by 20 meters. And our Y we're going to leave at 1 meter, which should be more than enough. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. I'm also going to hit the right bracket key a couple of times just to change our grid size. And I'm going to go ahead and scale this, or move this object up into the sky a little bit more. And we're going to go into the ETC, etc. tab and change our gravity to -4. I want to extend our animation to 300 frames. Go to Particle and also change our particle time to 300. And we're just going to scrub through and take a look. Now, we have a lot of particles in our scene right now, and it may be far too many for this effect, so I'm going to decrease our birth rate down to 25. And let's take a look at how many particles are being created. Still might be a little too much, so I'm going to go ahead and decrease the birth rate down to 5, and make sure I increase our particle limit to 10,000, just in case, even though we are working with a much smaller amount. And I'll raise this up into the atmosphere a little bit more. And that should be good. I am going to increase our time from 300 frames just up to 500. So I'll do that for our lifetime as well. And now we have an emitter in our scene. I'm going to go ahead and open the object properties and hit calculate. And then we can let that fully calculate all of our frames. And now what we can do is load in that object we had created. We can switch to Modeler and just send this rock object into Layout. Now if we take a look at the size, this is extremely large. Now if we're working with real scale, it's actually fairly small, and we would want to increase our overall dynamics and our emitter. But basically for right now, I want to keep this where it's at and actually just delete this object. And what I'm going to do is change the scale within Modeler. So minus key on the keyboard to clear this object out. We're going to switch back into Modeler, hit Shift H to open up the size tool, and just reduce the size of this object. We can save it, and now send this object back into Layout. And now we're going to see something a little more accurate for the scale that we're working with. Now I want to set up a surface for this object. So I'm going to switch to our camera view, and we're just going to select our camera and move it forward, and then open up our surface editor where we have the rock surface. I'm going to turn on smoothing and change our color to something of more of a brownish gray. Click OK, and now I can add in a color variation, the texture editor, use a procedural texture, and bring that down to a darker gray. I'm going to increase the frequency amount, increase our contrast, and also our small power. And then I will go ahead and reduce the size to 0.5 on all of our axes. And I can use this texture. And I also want to create a similar bump map. So I'm going to go back into the texture for our color, go to Copy, Selected Layer, Use Texture, go to our bump map, and then I can select Paste, Replace All Layers. And now we're going to have the same object showing up for our bump, and I may need to increase our overall amount. And it looks like this is not showing up correctly, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that, go back into bump, create a new procedural, and now we can see that showing up, and just kind of mimic the overall effect. It was probably because our frequency was set too high, so I'm going to reduce that value, and then I'm going to bring down the scale of our overall texture, use texture, and then bump we have set to 100%. I'm going to increase this to 200 to create a much more dramatic bump on our object. And now let's take a look at a render. So I'm going to switch to our camera and open up camera properties. I'm going to change this to HD TV 1280 by 720, which is 720p. Just give us a little bit of anti-aliasing. We'll use 4-pass, and we can render out the frame. And then we'll be able to take a look at our surface and see what we need to change. It looks like our surface will need to be scaled down a bit. So we can open up the surface editor. Under our bump, I'm going to increase our frequency amount, increase our contrast, and then decrease our scale a little more, down to 0.2, and now we'll go ahead and render another frame, and we can take a look at this object. And that looks pretty good, even though we have a very low polygon object. It will look good from far away, and with motion blur on, it'll look even better. We can go back to the surface editor. I'm also going to increase our smoothing threshold a little bit higher, just because it is so low poly. And we'll render out another frame. And this way we won't see that much of a polygon effect, and we're starting to lose what we were seeing before. So it does look a little bit better. And I am going to go back into our surface editor and just increase the bump up to 250. So just a little bit higher. We can render our frame. Click continue, and now we can see that surface that we've created. So I'm going to go back into Modeler, and I want to save this object. We could also save it directly within Layout. I'm going to switch back to Layout, and if we wanted to save this object, we could select File, Save Object, and then Save All Objects, or Save Current Object if we had an object selected. So we can select our object, Save Object, and then Current Object, All Objects, or any of the other variations. I'm going to now select our camera once again, T for the move option, and just move this out and look up into our scene a little. We can switch the perspective view and now start working on linking this object we've created to our particle effect. So what I can do is first I'm just going to select our dynamic object, go to the Dynamics tab, and select our effects linker. Our particles, we want to select emitter main, and since it is selected, it's automatically going to show up. And our replace object, we're going to select that rock low poly. And what this is going to do is link every single one of those particles to this rock, and it will clone it as many times as needed. Now if we take a look at the copy amount, right now it's set to 1, and it will be difficult to know how many particles we have until we actually take a look at the object. So I am going to hit cancel. We're going to go back into our dynamic object, scroll all the way to the end of the animation, open up object properties, and we can see that we have 104 particles. That means we're going to need 104 copies of this object. So we can go back to the effects linker, and now change this back to the rock low poly for replace object, and make 104 copies. And since this current object does not have any animation on it currently, we're going to need to set up animation within the effects linker. Now if this was an object that was already animated, we could bake that motion to the object, and that will carry on through all of our different copies. But since we haven't done that, and we want something a little more random and different from the other objects without having to go into the scene editor and change the different time frames, we can easily use these options that are available within the effects linker. And basically what we have is a rotation option, and we could set this completely to random. If we had motion on our object, we could select aligned path, but this also has to do with our particle motion itself, and the path of our particles moving down. So we could select aligned path with the heading of our rotation, but currently we really don't have any rotation on our particles because they're just falling straight down. There's also aligned path for heading and pitch that is available, so we can do aligned path heading or aligned path heading and pitch. And in order to see this a little better, we'll have to create a different particle effect that's going to have some rotation differences in order to see that effect. We can also copy the rotation directly from the emitter. So any rotation we have on the emitter will copy over to our objects. I'm going to select random, and this is going to create a random rotation on each of these copies on each of our particles. Now, in order to set up our random rotation, what we need to do is set up these values for the X, Y, and Z, or heading, actually, pitch, and bank, which we can see showing up. Random scale will be set to X, Y, and Z. So X, Y, and Z for these values, heading, bank, and pitch, or heading, pitch, and bank, bank being the last one, for our random spin and random rotation. So we can also spin these objects based on a speed value for both minimum and maximum of all of these. So let's take a look at random rotation, and we're going to set in some values for our heading and pitch and bank on all of our objects. Let's go ahead, and first we need to determine what the most amount of rotation we would like to have within the scene. So how many times do we really want these objects to be spinning? Since it is going to be simulating sort of asteroids coming in, they won't be spinning that much. They'll pretty much be going straight, so we don't want to create too much motion. So I'm going to create 30 on the heading. I'm going to do 25 for the pitch, and I'm going to do 35 for our bank. And these are our minimums, and the minimum amount they will be spinning. So right now, with these values, all of these objects will at least be spinning this amount. So technically, what I could do is really bring it down a little further if I wanted to have these objects, and some of them almost staying stationary. So I'm actually going to bring these down a little bit. We'll go ahead and make that 10. And now let's take a look at our max value, the most amount that we would like them to be spinning, or rotating. I'm going to set our max for rotation of heading all the way up to 180. And we're going to move on to our pitch, which I want to make 90. And then our bank, I'm going to make 85. So a little bit of a variation. What we can also do is set a random scale. Now, as it clones these objects, it will allow us to make different variations in scale. So that way we don't have the exact object copied over. Now, sometimes you may want that if you're creating maybe a flock of birds or anything like that. Then you would want to have a constant scale or subtle variations. But with an object like this, we do want a little more of a size variation. And we are going to change our scale on the X, Y, and Z for minimum and maximum. Minimum, I'm actually going to keep at around 1 for all of our values except the Y, which I'm going to be setting to 1.1, just a little bit of a variation. Our random scale for max, I'm going to change up to 1.5 because we don't want to go too large with these objects. And I'm going to do that for both the X, Y, and Z. We can also set the random spin, heading, pitch, and bank per second, the minimum and maximum. Since we have rotation set up, I'm not going to worry about spin that much, but I am going to add in some very low values for this. Our minimum, I'm going to set to 1. Or actually, I'll go ahead and set this down to 0.5, and then I'll set our max to 1. Very small amounts. We also have a size effect. This will allow us to use the size effect built directly into our emitter, which we didn't really cover too much, but we can always come back to and take a look at each emitter and also the wind options for size effect over time, and this can directly affect all of our objects. We also have a time shift, and with this type of object we're not going to need to worry about the time shift right now. And we also have post behavior. So basically, what do we want the objects to do after the particles have stopped or disappeared? And we also have a size dissolve, so we'll change our size after the effect, and maybe we'll shrink it, and will shrink itself back down. And we can also set it back to original. I'm going to stick with all of our settings we have right now and click OK. And now it's already cloned all of our objects. And we can take a look at our scene, switch to our camera view, and I am going to decrease the angle of our camera just a little. And now we can scrub through and watch all of these rocks falling from the sky. And because we have our spin set extremely low, we're really not noticing too much of the effect on each of these objects. The rotation we can see as a constant value for the random clones, and not something that is animated over time, I should definitely note. And then it's the spin that we want to use to control how much we are spinning them and having them rotate throughout the animation. I have it set to a low value so that they're going to stay about constant. And if I increase that spin value, then they'll of course spin more. Now if we take a look at the objects in our scene now, we'll be able to see all of the copies and clones of this low poly object showing up within our viewer and all of the different clones that are available. Now what we can also do, which is very cool, is still select our first object, which is low poly 1, and make modifications to it. So if I felt that maybe these objects should be sized up a little bit larger or a little bit smaller, I can select our low poly 1, go to our scale, and then reduce that, making sure that we're in scale and not stretch. And we're just going to move that down a bit. Have that refresh, and currently it doesn't appear as if it is modifying that too much. And it looks like that value is not carrying over, although sometimes you will be able to modify that first object, and then it will carry out through the scene. But it looks like right now, with the way this is set up and applied, I am not able to do that. But one thing I can do outside of layout is actually modify it within Modeler. So I can decrease our scale in Modeler, save that, and now if we switch back to layout, we're going to notice the rocks are much smaller. So we can modify it within Modeler, but not within layout. And now we have all of these linked to our particles, and now we can use these for even more dramatic effects. So if I wanted to have trails following each one of these rock objects, what we can technically do is, since these are broken up into individual objects, is apply the emitter directly to each object so that will reflect the geometry. The only problem with that is we have to go through every single object and apply that emitter. Now, using the dope sheet and another couple of methods where we can copy and paste and bring that back and forth, it might be a little easier. And if I would have added that emitter first to our scene, that would have cloned over onto our other objects. But since we still have those original particles in our scene, we can just use them to add the trails onto these rocks. So I'm going to do that really quick. Click Particle, HV Emitter, and we're going to name this Emitter Trail. And then we can click OK. And we are going to set this to the same group that we had before, which is the default, and is going to apply to everything in this case. And we want to generate, or have our nozzle be the parent emitter, which means we will also need to change our motion options. I'm going to increase our particle limit to 100,000, decrease our birth rate down to 20 because we are going to be creating a lot of particles, and then M on the keyboard to open up our motion options for the emitter trail. and our parent item is going to be emitter main. And now we can drag through the animation, and we can see those particles showing up. We're going to go back into the object properties, select the effects emitter, and I want to go to particle, increase the lifetime to 500 frames, and under motion, I want to increase our vibration to 0.5 to begin with. And now we can take a look at the trails showing up. And it does look like we will need to increase our birth rate in order to see this showing up on all of our particles. So I will increase our birth rate up to 40. And I'll also add another 0 to our particle limit. And now we can watch and see the trailing objects that we can add HV and Hypervoxels to for each of these rock objects. And if I want those trails to spread out a little bit more, I can increase our vibration all the way up to 1. And then we can scrub through and take a look. And that looks a little bit better. And now I'm going to go ahead and calculate this, and we can take a look at our particles in the scene. And we'll let that carry out all the way until frame 500. And now we have that properly calculated. I can close this out, and we can scrub through our animation. And now we can see all these rocks falling and creating a really nice trail behind them. Switch to our camera view, and I'm just going to zoom into our scene a little bit more. So we're getting a little closer to some of these objects. And now what we can do is add our Hypervoxels to this object. So I will select Control and F6 to open up the Effects Volumetrics tab, add in Hypervoxels. You can double click and scroll down to the emitter trail and turn that on. We also want to open up Viper so we can actually see these trails. I'm going to open up our preset shelf and load in one of the fire and smoke presets, and just load in smoke. And we can see that showing up. I could also load in one of the fiery ones. And one of these effects may not look entirely correct. We can go to our shading, change that to self. I could also change our hypertexture to make it a little bit larger. Maybe do 5 meters. And that doesn't translate entirely over to all of our objects, so I will just go back to our smoke for now. Adjust our particle size. We could add a texture effect to it. And we'll just see these nice plumes of smoke following behind each of these rock objects. And I'm going to render out a quick frame of this. First I am going to hit Control F5 and add in a gradient backdrop. Go back to frame 0 and just reposition our camera so we can see mainly the sky. Pull that down. And now I'm going to go ahead and just render out a frame, and we can take a look at our scene. And now we're currently not seeing these rocks show up within our scene because they're engulfed within the Hypervoxels. So what we would need to do is either increase the size of our objects, and we can see up at the top where the ones that have not fallen yet don't have any Hypervoxels. What I can do is create a size effect over time where we could have the Hypervoxels much smaller to begin with based on particle age, and then they can increase in size, and that will show our overall rock showing up, and that could look a little more interesting. What we could also do is, like I said, just increase the size of that object. But overall, you get the idea. It's a really cool effect we can use. I could also add another particle emitter to shoot flames out from the object, using the same method that I used to create our smoke plumes, except have them spread out a little bit more and maybe dissolve quicker. What I could also do is just modify this smoke to look like fire to begin with, and then fade out into the smoke. So there's a lot we can do with the hypervoxels on these particles to create a really cool looking effect. But that's the basics of our effects linker. Just working with single objects. Fairly simple scene. And next we're going to take a look at using the effects linker to create debris and a couple of other types of objects and items to create even more realistic looking effects and some cool explosions with rocks and different debris and things kind of rolling off of it.